So thank you so much, Janie. We've been emailing a little bit back and forth, and it's very nice to be able to see you and to hear your voice. And thank you for being with us. I'd like to begin to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Huron-Wendat peoples, and thank these nations for their care and stewardship over these shared lands. And we, as the living, have a responsibility to remember our dead. Mystery imbues both life and death. And I pray that our conversation today is one way of remembering our dead. And may our dead be welcomed here as well today. And Janie, I find your book, Radical Acts of Love, it's very transparent and moving, and it has such intimate and telling examples and stories of the lives of people preparing to die. And I really think that your book itself is a way of remembering and honoring the dead with all of their experiences and struggles and love of life. And so I really thank you for writing these human stories and making them available to us. And I noticed on your website a beautiful quote: "Death came out of the womb with you, but with the excitement at your arrival, no one noticed," by John O'Donohue. And in actual fact, our death is born when we are born. And so my first question is going to focus on quality of living and quality of dying. And as a society, we talk a lot about quality of living, and which I value as well, but I really wonder about quality of dying. And actually, the word dying or to die is an active word, not a passive word. It's not something that happens to you. Dying is actually something that's asking to be done. And I imagine you, Janie, have witnessed people engaging with and participating in their dying. And I imagine you have seen the absence of this as well. And so we speak of quality of living, and I wonder about quality of dying. And perhaps we do not have to choose between the two. I am getting feedback somewhere. Perhaps we do not have to choose between the two. Is it possible to include quality of dying along with the help and encouragement of healthcare teams to be part of and even to inform quality of living? And so, Janie, from your experience and perspective, what may be the work of dying? What could you say about quality of dying as well as quality of living?
Mhm. Well, first of all, thanks, Janita, for the question and for the invitation to be here. I love that we can travel across from Vancouver to Kingston or wherever else you are and be together.
Yes.
And, when someone asks me a question like that, I immediately want to reflect it back and say, I'm sure Janita has a fantastic answer to that question because it's something that you've obviously thought deeply about, but it's obviously something I have also thought a lot about.
Yeah.
Given my work for 30 years in the oncology system, so BC Cancer in Vancouver was sort of my home place. My background is master's in psychology and a master's in nursing. And so when I moved to Canada from Scotland, which is where I'm from, I worked at BC Cancer. And through those years, it was about 10 years of full-time work as a clinical nurse specialist there. As we all do, working in hospital or institutional settings, we're taking in a lot of information. How are these people experiencing this particular illness process or whatever it is they're going through? And so I watched and listened like we all do as professionals, and we take in, we start to ask questions. And I think this is where this question comes, Janita, that I really appreciate that there was so much focus, as there is in our healthcare settings, and necessarily so. There is so much focus on the disease process itself,
Yeah.
the body needing treatment, the body hopefully, orienting towards healing, whatever that means to the person. So especially in the palliative care hospice world, the quality of life phrase came in fairly early on, I think, in the history of palliative care. And it's a very beautiful phrase, actually. And it's a question we can ask ourselves whether we're ill or we're not ill. What's important to us? And of course, this is really what spiritual care is all about, this quality of life right up until the last breath. So that's kind of where we've been focusing our attention, I think, in palliative care is this quality of life, asking, what's important to you now? What can you do given the limitations of your experience physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually? So I think from my 10 years in the trenches of the BC cancer system, this invisibility of the dying process was very obvious to me. And
Yeah.
I remember one day I was down in the ambulatory care setting, and I heard obviously a young woman. I could tell by her voice. I could hear her talking, but behind closed doors, as we see so many times in hospital settings. There's a lot happens behind closed doors. And I suddenly heard a blood curdling scream come out of that room, out of her voice, out of her. And I remember, I mean, I'll never forget that moment. And I thought, and I had a strange response to it. And maybe some of you will relate to this. I felt relief that
Ah,
there was an expression of an emotion that
mhm.
seemed fitting to whatever news she had just heard. And I could only imagine, maybe it wasn't what I thought it was, that she had been told some very difficult news, and her response was just to scream.
Yeah.
And I think that, from these kinds of moments, I thought, what are the conversations happening where we can so easily do this amazing kind of skip around death, even the word death. And I think even in palliative care and hospice care, we are using a lot of phrases to skip around. And I don't mean that at all judgmentally. I think it's important that we orient people to the living that's possible. And I think that's so much of our work, isn't it? But then I think there still is this, and it's interesting, even 30 years into the work, I'm sitting in front of a young, woman or man who has young children, and this person's facing the end of life. I can feel my desire to
Yeah.
skip around the subject,
Mhm.
30 years later. So even those of us who work in these fields where death is very present, I can feel and I think it's an encultured response. I think
Mhm.
we've been, this taboo of death in our Western world, not true in all cultures by any means, but we've been very, even subtly now, being shifted around the subject of dying, and the word death and dying, I can feel my own. And so, of course, with that knowledge, we have to practice, don't we? Stepping in and stepping into conversations. And so, over the years, when I decided to found a nonprofit organization, it was really to create a space for people. And we do 1 week retreats, and we also have a center in Vancouver where people who want to, and again, this isn't everyone's, some people don't
Mhm.
want to talk about the quality of dying or the dying process. And of course, that's our job to respect that. But for the people who do, I imagined creating a space where there was a lot of openness and availability of those of us who work here to say, whatever conversation you want to have about that, then please have it. You're welcome to have it here. And actually, yesterday I was talking with a young woman who's just up against, when you meet people, and all of you do, I'm sure, that you just think, how can so many things happen to this young woman, and so many things be taken away from her? And she's in her 30s, and she's really up against now the end of her life. And she said, I'm just so overwhelmed with all the things I still want to do, all the
Yeah.
things that are left. And so I asked her if she could write, if she was up for it, because we're communicating by Zoom. She doesn't live in Vancouver. I said, would you be up to just putting all of that out of your head onto the page? Just give me a list of all the things. Because what I was aware of is it was very mixed up with, so I'll just give you, she gave me 70 things that she still wants to do before the end of her life. I thought, how on earth? No wonder she's overwhelmed by that. And then I said, can I help you just sort through that? And so helped her sort through the categories of the things that she felt important. And they were really things that I think we probably would all write if we had a list. They were
Yeah.
things to do with her history and her family, things she still wanted to tell people and share about her life. And then so there was a lot about the really what I think of as the quality of dying, this end of life planning, which,
Mhm.
you know, she didn't say, here's my end of life planning, but a lot of these things were about what do I need to do to, you know, to have a quality death. And they were very important things, things that she wanted to do still, you know, in her garden, things she wanted to organize around her celebration of life. And so again, rather than it being an official or formal, now we're going to do end of life planning, I think this is very natural to all of us. And I think this is what I took from that conversation with her, that there was these things that, and then there were creative things, you know, again, there's a whole bunch of things that she wanted to do creatively, and how do we find space for that? So it's a very long answer to your question, Janita, but I think this is what we do naturally, actually, if we're given a chance to not just look at the quality of life. And in fact, that can feel a bit like we're avoiding something if
Mhm.
we're close to the end of life. And of course, we don't know if we're close to the end of life. That's the big mystery of it all. But what would we, if we were to be asked that question, what's the quality of your dying? And when we take people on retreat, that's one of the sessions that we actually spend time on. And we ask people, if you could choose, how would you want your death to be? And that's
Mhm.
kind of really what you're asking, I think. How would you want your death to be? And that sounds like a huge question, but there are a lot of things people say in answer to that. And I'm always amazed how people have already, I mean, most people have thought about these things, but very, you know, very few people really verbalize those things to another person. When we verbalize, we activate something, don't we, inside of ourselves to say, okay, if I really want that, how do I go about making that happen? So
Yeah.
people can say things like, I want a pain-free death. Well, that's a big thing. So then you need a team. You need people who understand how to manage pain. You don't want to go have a team of people who have no idea how to help you manage pain, which is sadly true. There are, you know, you have to find the people who really know how to do that. So there's a way we activate when we start to verbalize the things that we wish for. And we may not get all those things we wish for, of course, that's the nature of life, but we
Mhm.
may get some of them, and we may be able to put our attention in this planning for the quality of our dying. And that's really what we help a lot of people to do. And I have to say, the preparation makes a difference, unless there's a sudden, obviously, if there's a sudden event that takes someone. But normally, people who have long term illnesses or illnesses like cancer, they have time to do this. But
Mhm.
mostly, you know, it's not something that we're yet. Well, I think there are many people who are having these conversations, like probably most of you on this talk today are finding ways to enter into conversation with people. And I
Yeah.
appreciate all of the courage it takes, even for those of us in the field, to step over that, what's like an invisible boundary, and say, okay, I'm going to just open a crack in the door and see if the person wants to come through with me. And if they don't, then I respect that. If they do, then we can have the conversation.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry,
Thank
that
you.
was a long answer to your question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in my question there is what you've addressed, but I also think about what does dying ask of us? What does death ask of us? And working in this field, we have an opportunity to see death far more. I mean, there are I know people that have never come close to death, have never had a close friend or family die, and they might be 50 years old, right? And it's in somebody's dying time and at death, although you don't have to be present for them at death, that we learn about dying and death, and that we start to learn, okay, what would we want, but we also start to learn about, okay, what's really important, what does dying ask of us, and the people that we leave behind, how I die, what does that, how do I want to contribute to them as they continue to live, and when their dying comes, like a child, for example, an adult child, when their own death comes, they may be remembering their parents' death, right? And so the question might even be, how do you parent somebody in your dying too? Because in some ways our parenting never ends. So these are really big things to wonder about, and they include so many things, so many aspects. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
if you'd indulge me, I'd like to just read a page from the preface of the book, because this is, I think this is a really, this is really what the core of the book, this question you're asking, because
Okay.
I called this book Radical Acts of Love because I think in our work we see this everywhere, where families or strangers sometimes too are able to provide a kind of a gesture or a conversation that to me is a radical act of love that
Yeah,
helps you to come into direct experience with the dying process.
yeah.
And so, because there's a point that I want to make just in response to that particular question. Would you be all right if I just read a little
That
passage?
that would be great. Thank you.
And this is the preface. So this isn't the stories. There are 20 stories in the book, so they're more. But I just wanted to read maybe the first couple of pages. So I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. Sorry for that. So I'll just read a couple of pages and then I'll speak to your question. So Gran was the first person I saw die. I was 19 years old and she was 81. She was my father's mother, and she lived with our family for the last couple of years of her life in a small cottage attached to the old sandstone house my three siblings and I were raised in, just outside Glasgow. Gran died of esophageal cancer, more common in those days because of the heavy cigarette smoking combined with her daily tipples of whiskey. I remember following Mum into Gran's bright white bedroom and watching over her shoulder as she washed my grandmother and changed the soiled sheets. I wanted to help her care for Gran, but I felt frozen, unsure what to do, even though I had worked in hospitals for 2 summers by then. Gran was my kin, not a patient. That made a difference then. I don't remember being afraid of death, rather just curious about the unusual smells in the room and the fact that she coughed a lot and didn't talk much. Mum made it okay. She didn't seem afraid either, just busy. She had been a nurse too, which must have helped her know what to do. There were no long, heartfelt conversations at Gran's bedside, nor long bucket lists of activities to be accomplished. There was just the work of dying,
Yeah.
for my Gran, the patient, and for my mum, the caregiver. I learned then that most deaths are natural, not easy, but not necessarily scary, nor traumatic or over medicalized, not romantic nor glorified. Death is most often ordinary and manageable, acceptable, but deeply sad. The majority of old people, like my grandmother, died at home in those days before it was commonplace to be admitted to the hospital or hospice for the last days or weeks of life. Most people now under 60 have never seen a person die, so have become deeply fearful about death, both their own and the deaths of their beloved others. They have had no role models to show them how to care for a dying person, and therefore no confidence in being able to do so. My hope is that the baby boomer cohort who pushed for the return of the midwives to demedicalize birth will also be instrumental in reclaiming the death process. This book is my contribution to the re-empowering of all of us to take charge of our lives and our deaths, remembering that we know how to die, just as we knew how to come into this world. We also know how to heal and how to settle our lives as best we can before we die. In my view, this is the greatest gift we could give our loved ones, to be prepared and open and accepting when the time comes for us to leave this world.
Mm.
So I think that idea that we have to learn what it means, to face into the end of life, and we need to learn how to help people do that. That's all true, but there is also, and I think many of you, I look forward to your questions because I'd love to know if this is your experience also. But there is a kind of intelligence that we have, and when you have the great honor to be at a birth or a death, you see this intelligence at work that the body knows what to do. I mean, the body knows how to die. And it sounds like such a strange thing to say. I can say it to you as professionals that there is this, there's a deep understanding of the body to know how to, if it's given the space and the chance to do that, which of course doesn't always happen. But there is and I'm not meaning, I'm meaning with a good medical and nursing and spiritual team around. That's the ideal. But there is an intelligence, and when you watch a baby being born, to me, I've been very fortunate to be at several births. You really see that that the baby is birthing, the baby is birthing itself. I mean, not to take away from the work of the work of the person giving birth, obviously, but there is this. So I think I enter into that relationship now, with helping people to find that trust, because the
Mhm.
fear, of course, is I'm not going to know how to do this. And I think in our perfectionist culture, there's a lot of focus on I've got to do it right. I have to do this perfectly. And so
Mhm.
I think in relationship with people, when we're working with people at the end of life, Janita, I'm sure you feel this too, that there's a lot of it's about imparting a trust that you know what to do, that it's in us, it's wired in, it's deeply in our natures to
Mhm.
know. And we need support and we need community and we need, of course, to be, as best we can to be uplifted in that process, which is also the work of the spiritual care community that you're all part of, is this, how do you help people who are buried deep in that despair or hopelessness or disconnection? How do we uplift and how do we help people to, find who they are in the midst of that rather than
Yeah.
just the illness itself? So I was a very, again, I hope you don't mind my detours around your questions, but they provoke me to think about these things that, again, we learn so much, don't we? A lot of you have probably been in
Mhm.
this work for many years, and I think we're trying to process all the things we've learned, and I think that for me, the book was to try to distill some of the learnings, really for my own, the need to articulate what is it that's happening, why when
Mhm.
I'm at the end of life with somebody, um, and I'm talking about within hours or days of death, why does this kind of stillness come over me? Like, what is that? Right? What is
Mhm.
what happens like in those moments where, again, I think there's a knowing that this is that, as I said in the preface, that this is a process that we're built for, all of us, and I don't want to sound, um, by any means disrespectful, that there's a lot to this, the work of dying, and I call it that because I think there is a lot of work in the physical process, but for the people who choose to, there's a lot of work to settle. I use that word settle because I don't think we ever close up our life in a tidy little bow. There's a lot of things that remain unfinished in our lives. So I'll stop there and then you could ask me another question. I hope this
Thank
is okay.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your beautiful response and for reading that piece as well. Thank you. Um, I think I'd like to go to moral distress. And it's certainly a part of my work, a part of our work, and I've read it's a part of your work as well. And so I'm thinking of the story of George. George defying death as a single story that really it's a true story as you write it, but it's also true in that it repeats itself over and over, not for everybody, but many times, right? In many places. And although this was early in your work, that's my understanding from how it's written, I see you move through it with such grace and love in that situation. And a couple of things that you wrote were whatever his body was doing or not doing, he was still a whole person. And at the end of life, we still matter. Yes. And I find that so beautiful. And I was really struck by your final sentence in that passage of, I recognize that a different kind of medicine was calling me home. And so would you please tell us a little bit about George and reflect on that aspect of fear and of moral distress that we can experience ourselves or even family members sometimes experience that, and the courage that's required to be of useful service in situations like that, and particularly within our society and within the culture that we live in, our culture around illness and dying and death.
Mm. Thank you for the question. This was a situation, I was a fairly young oncology nurse, and I think we all know and we can probably recall many stories where we've been in a situation with a family or with an individual where we can feel, and I tried to describe it in the book, it's like an arising of this, what I think really is moral distress. And it's where you find yourself in a kind of an ethical situation, but it's very personal. So it's not like you can put an ethical concept to it, although you could. You're in it as a person, and you're dealing with distress. And I won't tell the whole story because it would take too long. But this was a man in his, I think he was in his 50s, and he was he'd been in, many cycles of chemotherapy for his cancer treatment, and he was right at that stage where, was he going to enter into another cycle? And he basically, his wife, so again, we get ourselves into these distressing situations with families, right? Because not everyone comes at things in the same way, obviously. So his wife was absolutely rooting for him to do as much chemotherapy as he could tolerate, because she
Mhm.
said, I need you here. We have two kids. I basically need you here. And so she was really had an agenda, which we see often, right? And we had had many night shift conversations where he had told me that he really wanted to accept that he was going to die from his cancer. And he really didn't want to spend his last weeks in hospital, because he was quite symptomatic. So he needed to be in hospital for his treatment. He just didn't, he wanted to stop, and he really wanted to, say, that's it, let's face this together. And
Mhm.
his wife was not ready for that. So this is, and then what happened is that he became very, very ill. And the decision had been made that he would continue with treatment, a new chemotherapy. The decision had been made, even though he told me he didn't want to. So I was then in the position, as being an oncology nurse, of having to give the chemotherapy. And I struggled. It was one of those,
Mhm.
the nighttime, the waking night times, because I knew that that was coming, and I was going to have to give chemotherapy to a man that was really wasn't, probably now we would see it, probably wasn't competent to actually accept that treatment at that point. But I think these are things that happen in different ways in our hospital settings today. So I actually had to make the decision to not give that treatment, which was one of it was a very, very important point in my career, my professional life, because I didn't know I could do that. And I really, it was one of the most difficult things I had to do. I had to go and speak to the head nurse and say, look, I can't in all consciousness give
Mhm.
this treatment to someone who told me that this was not. But I also had to basically relate to his wife. And sometimes the terror when people are up against the wall with these awful, I mean, she was terrified at the end of the day. I know now I would have approached her differently, but she really scared me. And I think there are people
Mhm.
who are, it's like a primal force. My husband is not going to die. There are some people who have to rail against it, and there are people that are. It's difficult to confront those people, or even to relate to them, not necessarily confront them. So I had to do it through the system itself, and it was a very scary thing to do. But it was something I couldn't live with, and I think there are times in our working lives where we're up against those questions, where, how do I enter into this and be true to myself? And when do I have to yield? And as I've matured, hopefully a bit in my career, I see now that people make decisions, that they may not personally want. They make those decisions out of love for their families. And I think now I could see that differently, where we see
Mhm.
people at odds like that. And I probably would have then opened that conversation up with him to say, well, you've decided to go ahead. You told me you didn't. So, what is that? And I think we could have I think that's where the conversation would probably have gone. Like, it really matters to her. It really matters to her that I try. And so that's love. I mean, that's a radical act of love, to maybe take a treatment you personally don't want. And it's so much a different view now for me, because
Mhm.
and again, these, the autonomy is so big in our language now, individual rights. And, I have a right. And of course, it's coming up a lot in the medical assistance in dying movement, that people are choosing, and not necessarily in conversation with their families. So I think these are very big issues for all of us to confront. And I think that we do have to, at least what helps me, I should say, not that we do have to, what helps me is to see the whole unit as a system. That's really what helps me to see how is this family, and those of you who've studied family systems know that this is a really important way to view situations like that. And I was part of that system. I was there, this person that was being told that's my job. I have to do that. And when can I step out of a system because it's not supporting something in me that I would have crossed a boundary in myself. So I think I was young. I'm not sure I would do the same thing today. I might have had a different conversation with him. I might have had a different conversation with the family and then found a place of peace to be able to proceed in that
Mhm.
situation because I had a larger view. So of course the larger view for all of us is what we carry. I think I don't know what I would do if I didn't have a larger view of these, terrible things that happen to people in life and the suffering that people endure. And how do we make sense of all that and do our part, play our part?
Mhm.
So I think I could stop there.
Yeah, and it's just it was very um, it really hit me kind of how that was an experience that really changed the direction of how you wanted to work, of
Mhm.
how you wanted to work in this field. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for so many years I was so committed to working in the system because the system is necessary. I'm talking about the healthcare system.
Yeah,
It's where people go for healthcare. So I wanted to be part of that. And I spent many years and I'm grateful. And at a certain point, I think for me, and again, each of us reaches these moments either at retirement or, where we step out of a committed professional path. I didn't step out. What I wanted to do is when I discovered a program in Bolinas run by Michael Lerner and Rachel
mm,
Naomi Remen. I think it was one of the again a moment where I said, "Oh, this feels very in alignment to create a program that complements the system and the work that goes on in the system and the care that goes on in the system. Just to for me personally to create a space where I could do work in the way that I needed to do it. And I think we
mhm.
all can find that within the places that we're working. And I did that for years, found my allies, found the people who I wanted to grow and learn with and from. And then at a certain point, I decided to leave the BC Cancer and create this organization with a lot of
Yeah,
support from those mentors and others. So yeah.
yeah. Thank you. So I would like to talk a little bit about death phobia. I think that both areas that we've already spoken of touch on death phobia and they're influenced by death phobia and our fear of dying, especially in the dominant North American culture, is very prominent and sometimes it's very difficult. I find very difficult to even identify death phobia. Some ways are very obvious, but there's a lot of underlying things that are just really hard to recognize and to try to influence. And so I'm wondering about your experience. What were clues for you that death phobia was in the room? How did you address death phobia? And what were helpful ways to identify and possibly help shift death phobia? I'm wondering if you could speak to some of that for us that are working in the institutions.
Mhm. When I read your question that you sent to me yesterday, and that term death phobia, it's not a term I ever use. It was just
Mhm.
interesting to me. I'm not sure why, because of course, phobia is, a deep fear.
Yeah.
So a deep fear of the process of dying or the deep fear of death itself. And of course, those are two different things. So that's usually where I start. If I can, and again, it's obvious in certain ways when that's present if you're working with a family because you're listening closely to the language, right? So the language is, for me, one of my first clues of what's going on
Mhm.
here.
Yes.
So, and the language, we become very observant in our listening at all
Mhm.
levels, but language to me, I suppose it's because it's a love of mine. I really listen to the words people say. So the
Mhm.
fear to me is it shows itself very quickly in conversation with somebody. And it shows when they steer away from a conversation that is getting closer, right? So you start to feel that. So of course, fear is we're born with fear for good reason to keep us safe. And so
Mm.
to me, the way I come at fear is to look at safety and what would make this person feel safe right now with me in this conversation, and what would make people feel safe at the end of their life. And this is where the conversation, in a way, has to go back in time, because so much of the extreme fear, and I'll say that because you're using the word phobia, the extreme fear, and again, I'd love to hear what others think of this, for me often does go back to situations in life where people have been terrified or powerless or frightened. And so there's some stories in the book about that, how we've helped people deal with situations that then get informed, often right at diagnosis. There's a threat, and
Mhm.
so the body remembers earlier threats in life, whether it's war, whether it's threats in your family of origin. So the body remembers the early fears that you've gone through as a child or as an adult. So we're not meeting fear of what's exactly in front of us when we're working with people. We're meeting fear that belongs to their lifetime,
Mm.
a lifetime of
Mhm.
experiences. So that feels really big when you think, well, how on earth are we going to get to that? But again, what sometimes people need, and we all know this in the work that we do, there's one story they have to tell. Sometimes it's one story that's been locked away that is the root of the fear of dying. And, again, I think there is a primal fear of death in and of itself because it's a mystery and we're very frightened of the unknown. And I think that that's, again, the practice. That's why we use a lot of creative work. Now I'm going on a tangent in our work here at Callanish, because the unknown is the mystery. And so in the creative work, so whether that's writing or art or music or making music or whatever, there's a threshold you reach of the where you have to step into the unknown. Of course, death is that. You have to step into the unknown. That's why it's so frightening.
Mhm.
So I think that there's a way to help people practice that, being in the unknown in that conversation. And by naming that, this is something we can't pin down with a belief system. We can try, and people, as you know, have many belief systems. We all have our own belief systems, but the belief system at the end of the day doesn't always help that primal visceral fear. And that visceral fear can be related to the past. It can also be related to the fear of the future. So I think we have to uncover all of these things. And I honestly, I mean, I'd love to hear from, I can't see most of you here, but thank you to the people I can see, by the way, because it's nice to see your faces. Um, uh, so I think our work is it's like the detective, where is what is the fear? What's at the root of this fear? And I don't know. I can only inquire. And if
Mhm.
we're willing to inquire deeply about their life and how fear has, did you learn to be anxious and fearful? What were your parents like? I mean, so many people say, oh, my mother or my father was, very anxious person, worried about everything. So worry, anxiety can build into fear. So I think it's investigation, and I would, assume that most people have fear. It's a normal response to life. Life is scary. Life is threatening. So we come at it as humans to say, yeah, this is what I'm afraid of. And I
Yeah.
think for some people who have never seen someone die and they're facing their own death, some of one of the suggestions I make is can you, if the person is able, could they participate somehow in a hospice training, or could they actually familiarize themselves with what death is? Because again, it's this mystery, and a lot of it
Mhm.
can be known. A lot of it can be known and experienced.
Mhm.
Working with animals, people learn about death through working with animals. There's just so many. So fear and safety, to me, it's like that's the question I ask.
Yeah.
What would it take for you to feel safe in this situation? and they may not know, but they may be able to say, well, these are the things. So those are very important things when they say, well, what I feel most safe is when I'm at home in my own, you know, living room by my fire. You know, they're
Mhm.
very important clues to, okay, safety means being cozy and, you know, being protected. So I think if we can work on the feelings, because hospitals so much so they often, because they don't have boundaries of safety, people don't know how to create their cocoon. Or you'll see some people, they'll bring in all their bedding and you know, they'll make a cocoon of safety. Those are people who really, safety is a very important and you know, primal need to be able to be unafraid,
Yeah.
or the fear is just lingering continually
Mhm.
and then keeps getting informed by the future, or what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. And then whatever their myths and about dying itself, of course we can help with that, can't we?
Mhm.
We can help talk about, well, this might happen, but these are the things that could help prevent that happening. So I think this is a, you know, again, we're part of advocating for people getting the support they need so they can be less afraid. So it's a big subject. I mean, it's a subject
Yeah.
I'm really interested in. And actually, we did something quite interesting over the years. We we actually built a threshold, which sounds strange, but it came to me. We built a gateway, which is gorgeous, out of kind of yellow cedar.
Yeah.
And we work with that very specifically around the fear of dying. And these are people who come on retreat who've said, I really need to work on, I want to, you know, prepare, and I want to be, understand my relationship to death, and I want to understand how to be less afraid, how to be more at peace. And so
Mm.
we've had to develop strategies and processes that I think help people. We do a lot of work on grief, with grief, and a lot of work with grief ceremony, and ways that people can help contain their grief, because the grief can be very frightening. The loss is frightening for a lot of people. So we've been working with this idea of the threshold, which I think is, again, enough. It doesn't pin it down, and you know, because we don't want to put
Mhm.
any concepts on that. You know, we're going somewhere. Some people don't have those beliefs, some people do. But it's a very interesting working with this intelligence that I've been talking about,
Mhm.
because people, first of all, when we put it up in the group room where people have had their group sessions, and it's about 8 feet tall, what really struck me the first time we used it in a group was that most of the group don't see it after they've been in that. They come into the room and they don't actually see that there's structures, because it fits into this beautiful alcove in the room that we use.
Mhm.
And I think that's interesting, you know, that
Mhm.
maybe death is here all the time, as you said, that beautiful quote from John O'Donoghue. And
Mhm.
then when people actually just stand up in relation to it, they have a lot of information comes to them about their relationship with death itself. So these are ways we can help people understand, what is your relationship to death? What, you know, where does this fear come from? What is it that you think about? Some people say, I'm curious. I'm curious about it. I'm going to be relieved when death comes. I'll
Mhm.
feel like I'm going somewhere good. That's a comfort to me. So again, I think the inquiry, I think, is the most important thing, rather than the overlay, because we
Mhm.
want people to have strong beliefs, because then it's easier. So
Mhm.
there are a lot of people who don't have
Mhm.
strong beliefs, and I think we all
Mhm.
work in spiritual care working with that. You know, there's people who don't have something to depend upon or rely upon, that they can
Mhm.
say, you know, this I'm, you know, I know what happens. So
Mhm. Thank you. I have a bunch of questions here, but I'll ask one more and then we'll open it up. And so it's, I think about spiritual distress. I wonder about that. And I think in particular to spiritual health practitioners. So have you recognized particular human needs and areas that may often be forgotten or overlooked or not tended to, that you could address specifically for us as spiritual health practitioners, that we could be more mindful of, or that or particular kinds of education that, like, do you see some gaps maybe in the work that you've done that spiritual health practitioners could tend to more? Do you
Mhm.
have some advice for us as spiritual health practitioners?
I like to say you're the experts on that. That's
Yeah,
not
I
my
know, but
but
you've had some
yeah,
experience from the other side and you've witnessed some of these things.
yeah. I mean, I think there's the let me think for a minute. I think what, the people who I think are in what I would describe as spiritual distress are the people that, we meet most days, and they've lost connection, whether it's to themselves, whether it's to their family, whether it's to God or their greater spiritual, connection. And so the disconnection is, I think, what creates so much challenge. So I think, um, so it's the disconnection, and then it's also the lack of ability to take what's inside out. So all the experiences that have been stored up, I mean, the traumatic experiences that are being stored up, this contributes to the distress because it contributes to what's coming next. If this has all been terrible and awful through the filter of, and it's so distressing, then this expectation that will continue to be distressing. So that's why that's so much part of our work, isn't it? Being a safe place to hold the stories of other people's distress. And that's why it's hard work. So we are the receptacle, and the clearer the receptacle, I think the more efficient it is. So that's a plug for our own work. Just, what do we carry around? And, when in the work, we carry around families we've worked with, individuals. There are so many things that we witnessed, so many things that create our own distress. So I'm a huge advocate for, and this is what I aspire to myself, is how clear can my own receptacle be to receive the pain of other people. And
Mhm.
again, I think that's a lifelong job because we keep collecting up more things. So that to me is what people really feel. They they feel that clarity that you bring to the
Mhm.
conversation. And I remember a woman said to me once, I can tell the nurses who are burned out by the way that they enter the room, the way that they talk to me, the way that they want information, the way they ask questions. And she said, it just makes me close up. I don't want to talk to someone who's burned out because I have too much empathy for them. I want them to go and, have a rest or something. So I don't
Yeah.
want to overburden. And I'd never thought of that before. It's like we
Mhm.
think it's invisible, but of course, when people are in that, in their room or their bed, they're watching, they're listening, and they're seeing a tired person who isn't, so are they going to open up? So these are all questions. What helps people to relieve, because that's often what they need most to relieve the distress is someone is able to hold a space for me, not tell me how to fix it or give me advice, and who could actually receive it. And that is our work, isn't it? To receive
Mhm.
that, then to figure out how to transmute it ourselves, because that's what we take home. But it really is, to me, the way that we can be most helpful for spiritual distress or any distress is to be that and I use the word receptacle because I do think we receive it if
Mhm.
it's we really need to receive it, and it's not easy to do. We all know
No,
that. And so I suppose I'll stop there. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. So we're wondering now at this point if there's somebody that has a question, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask Janie your question, or if you have some comments or reflections that you'd like to make.
I have a question, please, on that topic of spiritual distress and self-care and burnout. Janie, you started your talk by mentioning that story of hearing in the hallway the blood-curdling scream. And professionally, you felt a relief that there was some opportunity to work with that person. But I'm wondering what that did to you personally, and if you ever felt that you were becoming burnt out in your career and what you did to
Yeah.
not be burnt out.
Yeah. That's a really important question. Thanks, Robert. Definitely, I've been at the place where I don't think I could take in any more I mean, it is that feeling of taking in. And I think we're all different that way, but I definitely feel in the early days when I felt like there's an amazing painting, Italian painter, that one of the Madonnas, and there's a woman, you know, this face and the cloak, and she carries people in this cloak, villages actually. There's pictures, animals, and that's sort of how I feel. And I think when it gets too full, I do know that place of, and I think for me, what I learned was that it wasn't necessarily the people and the stories that were burning me out. I think it was the other things that were required of me, where I couldn't necessarily have a place to, you know, to be with my team. Like the teamwork was lacking, and I think that's one of the things I've really put in place here at Callanish, because to me, that's really all we need, an ally, to be able to say that was, wow, that scream, that took me to my knees. You know, I just needed to say that to somebody, and I don't know what to make of that. You know, I want to go in the room, I want, you know, all these things. So that was kind of a, you know, a great example of what do you do with that. You know, there's a lot of anguish behind that door. I couldn't do anything about it. It also took me into, yeah, the anguish of the screams that aren't heard but are there every day with people. So I think we do have to recognize what lifts us. And for me, and again, we're all different. For me, it's team. It's team and community, and it's also having enough elements to the care to help lift up the situation. And that's what I mean by creating the environment where healing conditions are in place. So it's a term that Michael Lerner uses. You know, what are the conditions for healing in this situation? And it isn't just talking and receiving, you know, the suffering. It is also trying to identify for that person what is a healing condition right now. And it might be to turn on some music, or it might be to go for a walk in the forest, or, I mean, we need help. We can't do it by ourselves. So we need to be able to identify the healing conditions so that we feel supported and helped in that work, if that makes sense. So that's how I think of it now, Robert. I mean, I'm when you get close to being burned out, I think we know it, and often we feel trapped. I felt trapped for a while until I figured out that I needed to go and change my environment, so that I could create the conditions whereby I could feel the healing for myself, that I wasn't going to go down with the ship. There are times where I felt I was just going to basically, you know, get sick or just not be able to cope. And I think, you know, many of us have been in those junctures. But then over the years, you built so much wisdom and experience. The solution isn't necessarily to leave, or the conditions aren't where you could go and create some other environment. It's not always the case. So within the workspace that you're in, what would that mean to you to create conditions for healing where you remember your wholeness in that situation? Yeah. Big question. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Is there anybody else?
I have a question. Hi, Janie. My name is Tim. I'm a colleague of Janeta's here. I recently heard somebody else speak about a book that she had written about her work with patients who were dying. And she had a lot of caution about writing about people and the permission you need to have to share their stories. At the same time, she was encouraging all of us also. And I guess I'm curious what process you went through, either to seek permission, I haven't read your book, or what you did to anonymize to protect people.
Yeah. I won't go through all the details, but it was a very, very difficult process for me, because I just assumed I shouldn't and couldn't write about people like that. So, and then the permission, of course, is easy when the person's here, but after they've died, what do you do about that? So I did some consulting, particularly with an ethics professor actually at Dalhousie. And I wanted to go through a framework to see what I could and couldn't do. So there were some things I couldn't include in that book. And I was, you know, each story I was rigorous about, and what permission I had received. a lot of the stories, when I could, I sent them to the family if I couldn't have direct permission from the person themselves. So, and that was really important to me, that the family actually read the story, because I also didn't want it to go out into the world and suddenly a family finds that story. That just was so scary to me. And so I went through, and it was, I wanted to make sure I was as rigorous as I could be, because I think the stories are really important, and they, as the family said, the teachings live on. So that's, an Indigenous friend of mine said, these are teaching stories, and we treat them in a very specific way. The teaching stories, we're very careful about them, and we are careful about how we release them and what we release. And that really helped me too. So I had a lot of mentorship about it, because I think it'd be sad if we couldn't share, but there's professional obligations as well. So I did go through quite a process, and there were some stories I definitely did not include for that reason. So the ones I did, I feel really good about. But I went through quite a process, and there were times where I thought, I'm not going to write this book, because I read books where people have revealed stories, and I think, well, did they, I want to know that you feel that it's the right thing to do. So yeah, so thanks for the question. It's a really good question, and now I'm much more rigorous, because now I'm starting to write my next book. I'm getting it written, like I'm getting permission written. But some of those stories were from 30 years ago, right? So I had to be really diligent about what I could do about that. So yeah, I appreciate the question.
Janie, I really would like to thank you for being with us in this way. And in an interview that I listened to, which was, I think, with Barbara Morningstar,
Oh yeah.
I heard you say, you were speaking about your work and how it, which you just said even, brings me to my knees. And I'm glad for it. And it breaks my heart, and I'm glad for it. And it's really something to hear that. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. And in that, I hear a willingness to really be open to life and to the people that you're working with. And through that, I can really hear the respect that you carry for the people you work with, for these stories that you carry, these teaching stories, and for your willingness to put yourself on the line in some ways in your work, but also in your sharing with us and through your books. And so I really deeply thank you and regard you for your work and for your willingness to be with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this time with you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming to. All those I can't see or don't know who are there. Thanks for the ones I can see. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. Nice to see your faces. Hi, Anne. That's nice.
I'll definitely listen to this recording, and there's so much in it that it's hard to pick up the first time, but it's very valuable. Thank you kindly.
Thank you. Well, I hope you all, well, I hope maybe we'll meet one day in person.
Yeah.
It's nice to, yeah, Zoom is one thing, isn't it? But here we are. That's all we have. So it's good.
Yeah. And I'll read Andrea's comment to you. She had to leave, but Andrea is a teaching supervisor at one of the other institutions, and she says, "Thank you so much for sharing your authentic self on this important topic. Your work aligns so well with what we are learning about spiritual health and the deep ways in which healing happens in relationship and the importance of the quality of the relationship. I could listen to you for longer, and we'll be turning to your book to keep the conversation going." That's from Andrea.
That's nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I think we're at the end of time, and I thank everyone online and Janeta, and our special guest today, Janie Brown. Next month, we'll have a spiritual health grand rounds on the topic of ethics. Our guest will be Jonathan Butler, who's going to address the question, what does an ethicist do? Please look for information to that talk. And again, Janie, you've given us lots to think about and reflect upon, and again, special thanks to you for your talk with us today.
Thanks. Thanks,
Bye,
Rob.
everybody.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.